Here we go.
Where are you?
Welcome to Welty at Home. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and I'm so happy that we're back again after our small break. Today, we are going to be discussing Volume 3, Chapters 1 through 4 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And if your book isn't divided into volumes, that would be chapters 43 to 46. Remember to comment or to ask a question. You're going to click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select raise hand. If you're on a tablet or a phone, you may have to tap the screen for this option to appear, but it is there. And don't forget to keep another eye on the chat. There's usually a great discussion taking place in the chat, and sometimes people share links. Don't miss out on that. I'm so pleased once again to be joined today by our moderators, Susan Allen Ford, Professor Emerita of Delta State University and editor of Persuasions, the Jane Austen Journal, and Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and Professor Emerita at Millsaps College. So here we are today, and I'm going to turn over our discussion. Before the chat started, we had a really fun discussion about our Jane Austen merchandise and apparel. So I don't know if any of you are wearing Jane Austen merchandise to this, but if you are, you're in good company. Oh, good.
Read Jane Austen, y'all.
But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderators today.
Okay, well, it's great to be back with y'all, and here we are in road trip number 3. And when I was looking back at this morning, I came across the sentence at the end of the 3rd chapter. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, and everything but himself. And I thought that was such a nice sentence because it really gets at the way in which these first chapters of Volume 3 pull us in and get us to think about Darcy again, and look at Darcy again, and get Elizabeth to do that too. Austen is not known, or is actually, let me say it differently. Austen is known for not having lots of descriptions of clothes or landscapes or houses in the way that other novelists of the period would. But here we are opening Volume 3 with a chapter that is just shy of the length of the Netherfield chapter. So it's the second longest chapter in the book. It gives us the Netherfield Ball chapter I'm talking about before. So this one is the second longest chapter in the book. And, it really is, we can understand why it's so long because there's so much that goes on here. But much of it is description. So I guess that's kind of where I wanted to start today by talking about that first chapter in Volume 3, and we can move into the others as we need to. What's Austen doing here, giving us all this material? What are we learning about Darcy or about Elizabeth, for that matter, or the Gardners, I guess? Oh, before you answer that question, I wanted to say, this is actually, Austen is really in a kind of tradition of landscape and using the great house here that really goes back to the Renaissance. So you have Ben Jonson's poem, for instance, To Penshurst, which is a poem that focuses on the seat of the Sidney family. And there's
I was just there, so I was just at Penshurst with Johnson in hand.
Where are you really?
Yeah.
Well, that's one of my favorite poems in the world. But it's all about the kind of moral values of this landscape and how they are connected to the family. And then we have other poems in the Renaissance like that too, like Marvell's Appleton House, or in the 18th century, we have Tom Jones, the novel, with Squire Allworthy's Paradise Hall, that gets at this kind of seat of virtue, as his name and the name of the house suggest. And then when we get into the 1790s, we really see the estate as this kind of contested area. Edmund Burke, in Reflections on the Revolution in France, is talking about the English Constitution and using, as he does, the metaphor of the landed estate. And that gets at the kind of stability of the country, but it's also under threat. And in the novel of the 1790s, and which is when the first version of this novel was written, the estate becomes a metaphor for the country and the forces attacking it. So we really have a kind of tradition that Austen is kind of setting this description in, I think. Anyway, so that's what I was going to say, and it looks like we've got people who are ready. Harriet, add to this or say something?
Yeah, I'm thinking about so much. In many ways, Pemberley is the moment of complete persuasion for Elizabeth to Darcy, and it's presented as material. She looks at it and she says that she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. That of this place I might have been mistress, and she's thinking about the taste and elegance of the place. But more than that, it strikes me that what she's really thinking about is a place in society which is not vulgar in the sense of wanting rank. It is about recognition of the responsibility that Pemberley implies in terms of understanding Darcy. I'm thinking about the moment when she thinks, as a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much pleasure or pain it was his power to bestow. And she understands suddenly that that's not only his sphere of influence, but that it might have been hers as well. That it presents a kind of aspiration in Elizabeth that she hasn't previously imagined, and I think it's right there in her cataloging of the grandeur of Pemberley, a grandeur which is about the possibility of having social influence in a way that might be an issue that might be about social responsibility, responsibility to the culture as a whole, and to the people who live there.
Yeah, that is so interesting, and I think we partly get that through Mrs. Reynolds, who talks about how Darcy's tenants and his servants think of him. And I mean, we really get a sense of him as somebody who's in that community. And in fact, I mean, that's something that's pretty constant through Austen's use of the estate. She's very aware of the role of the estate in the larger community, as are these other writers. It's not just about a nice house. And in fact, Elizabeth says, I'm not really interested in going to any more fine houses, richly furnished. And her aunt says, oh, no, you're not getting it. This is about something bigger. And she's talking about the landscape, but Austen is talking about the something bigger. And you're right. I think that's exactly what Elizabeth is seeing. And we go back to Lady Catherine. We saw her as not merely somebody who inhabited that fine house, but who, scolded her tenants into plenty and was interfering with them and really was kind of managing that community. Not that we want Elizabeth to be a Lady Catherine, but I mean, this is, you know, an equivalent position or role. Yeah, that's really interesting. Monica.
I'm glad you brought up Lady Catherine because I hadn't realized until this reading that I do think they're setting up, well, they are setting up a very clear comparison to Lady Catherine. At the very beginning of chapter 1, it's my page 236, we get, first of all, I love that you can see the outside from all of the rooms, that they aren't like claustrophobic, stuffy rooms like Rosings is, but you actually can see the outside, which may connect to this idea of that this splendor is about, you know, your responsibility. But when she's describing the rooms were lofty and handsome and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw with admiration of his taste that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendor and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. I mean, she definitely says he's got way better taste than Rosings does. And so I think there's an interesting comparison to be made. I don't think that Lady Catherine's housemaid is going to talk about her the way that Mrs. Reynolds talks about Mr. Darcy. And so I think she has this kind of overbearing, constantly scolding approach to her tenants in a way that the Darcys are better at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think we're meant to keep, you know, looking back both to our other two house tours, Rosings and Hunsford, because we had a tour of that one too. And I mean, what you said about the windows that we keep looking out of here, I think is really fascinating. And actually, Rosings has a lot of windows. Elizabeth looks at them, remember, and thinks about, well, boy, there are a lot of windows here, and she thinks about the window tax when she's looking at that. They don't seem to be that useful. But nobody's looking out of the windows in Rosings. They're all kind of looking inward. And I think that really, helps make the point that you're making.
Can I say one thing
yeah.
before we? I also think looking out that window, or when she's outside, the landscape really is important, because this landscape is natural, but it's nature shaped by art. The river is broadened in front of the house. There's artifice brought to bear here, and you have art and nature working in harmony in a rather 18th century like way. And that's what happens inside the house as well. Comfort, elegance, not ostentation.
Yeah, the landscape is neither formal nor falsely adorned, and so it looks very natural, but we really get a sense that art has been mobilized here to give us this kind of natural and beautiful perspective. Yeah, I think we want to talk some more about those windows and all the scenes and the way she keeps looking. But Cheryl, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was actually going to, where Suzanne just went is what I was going to quote from.
Sorry,
I know you did it before me, but quoting from the book, Elizabeth's first look at Pemberley, she had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste.
Yeah.
And the thing is to remember that the Austen sisters were both artists. Cassandra with her wonderful, I guess it's called watercolors or whatever the sketches are. So they would appreciate natural beauty. And then the talk about windows, it's like windows are different perspectives. They're different eyes onto things. And that's all.
Yeah, and when, now I've got to find this. She goes from window to window, right? Oh yes, here it is. This is on page 236. She looks at it in one place. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions.
Mhm.
but from every window there were beauties to be seen. So, I mean, what we really are getting here is a sense of Elizabeth looking from multiple perspectives as she moves around to see all these things outside. And then, of course, she's in that landscape too, tracing a path, wanting to find more. I mean, it's really interesting, I think, the way that vision, perspective is really central to this chapter. Joellen, were you going to say something? You're up in the corner of my screen.
Yeah, I was. Maybe I can link it in here. We've been talking about Elizabeth as appreciating the art of landscape. And I was worrying the fact that we're told she knew nothing about the art of painting, which is another way of looking that occurs in this book. And I think I've worried before a little bit what I need to go back and check some things about what Darcy was seeing in her. I mean, we don't have much evidence that she reads that much, etc. But she clearly is associated with the outside, as her muddy boots after her trek to Netherfield Hall suggest. But it just came up in this chapter that she knew nothing about the art of painting. And Darcy doesn't seem to worry about all of his notions of accomplished women here, but she is looking out these windows, and we see her making more and more informed judgments. So there's a kind of art in that. But also throughout here, the note of vision, what you see, gets linked to the fact of evidence. We have all kinds of evidence being presented about people in these few chapters. So vision, looking, sifting things are all important.
I want to briefly pick up what you were saying about what she knows or what she's read about art. And he asks her early on, I think, or maybe it's Lady Catherine, one of the two, says, "Do you draw?" And she says, "No, not at all." But she does, I mean, she has read about the picturesque. Back in, and we were talking, Jessica and Suzanne and I were talking about this before we started, back when she's visiting Netherfield, and the Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley are walking, and she's been walking with Mrs. Hurst, and then, you know, Mrs. Hurst leaves and kind of holds on to Darcy's other arm. And so there are three of them there. And Darcy realizes how rude they're being and says, "Oh, let's take a broader path. You know, we can't get a fourth, you know, on this one." And she says, "Oh no, you're charmingly grouped. The picturesque would be spoiled with a fourth." And William Gilpin's theory of the picturesque, which Austen really read a lot, you know, has things grouped in threes and fives. Usually they're cows, you know, or trees to make a picturesque little grouping. And so Elizabeth's joke there is kind of a cow joke, but it's also evidence that she knows that, you know, she's read the picturesque. She's read about the picturesque. She understands the principles. And so she understands landscape without maybe understanding how to draw it, or, you know, what to think about when you're looking at painting, I think.
A good point, thanks.
Cheryl, you were going to say something?
If we talk at some point about the manipulations and the movements that some of the women make, like Charlotte making sure that she was going to meet Mr. Collins on the road, but that walking scene that you just mentioned is also where the aunt, Mrs. Gardner, abandons Lizzie's arm for her husband's arm, so that Lizzie and Darcy can then walk side by side. And so I think what we could talk about when we get to it is how there are good manipulations and with good intentions, and those that have negative intentions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really seen that as a maneuver. I'd seen it more as she was just needing some support because she wasn't really a walker. um, and it just happened to work out nicely for Elizabeth's and Darcy's purposes. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, Austen doesn't really ask us to make judgments that are truths universally acknowledged, that say that maneuvering or manipulation is always bad. I mean, there are times when you want to leave somebody alone with somebody else.
I was going to
Yeah.
say that I really appreciated in what Joe Ellen was saying, and I think that you can tell me if I have it right here, that these seeing out of all these different windows, all the different perspectives balances the way Darcy is seen now, finally, from so many different perspectives of the people he knows in the area. So we're getting a new view of him in the same way we get these multiple views of the landscape through the windows.
Yeah, I mean, think about all the views we get. We're picking up lots of different kind of information. Well, and so is Elizabeth through all this. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the way landscape is being used here. And what sets Austen apart a little bit from, or maybe a lot from other writers. We have something like, I don't know, Mysteries of Udolpho, and there are pages and pages of landscape description there. And she's not really interested in that. I mean, what she does is imbue the landscape with qualities that tell us things about Darcy. And at the same time, she's showing characters figuring out or looking at the landscape themselves and making judgments. So it's the landscape here is partly about Darcy and what it tells us about him, and partly about Elizabeth and how she's looking at it. I would say. Yeah, Joellen?
I think that's really significant, Susan, because this part of the whole 3 chapters that we've read are partly about redeeming Darcy, reevaluating Darcy at the same time they're reevaluating Wickham, and finally kind of testing Elizabeth. But Elizabeth's responses to Pemberley, as you mentioned earlier, show us some also of what Darcy would see in Elizabeth. Though I don't know, maybe on walks, but that she is so sensitive to it, to the outdoors and the landscape. But it certainly reflects her growing appreciation of him as well as his property.
Yeah, and just I kept following just the way in which she was surprised at different moments in this whole scene, how she's taking in information and thinking, well, that's nothing I've heard before, that he was a bad-tempered man had been her firmest, belief. And she still has opinions about him that need to be overturned. Monica.
So I have a question. So what would, of the time, was there some sort of belief or understanding that like being more sensitive to nature was some sort of good quality or something? Is there some sort of character trait that being responsive to nature is a reflection of?
Yeah, well, I think it's a virtue in and of itself, right? And especially as we get into the Romantic period, it's nature for Wordsworth and others becomes that kind of best teacher, that kind of can help. That gets at sort of the true being of the self in some way, and I mean, Wordsworth even talks in that preface to Lyrical Ballads about how the language of the people who live in nature is in some ways the purest, you know, and their feelings and their thoughts are the most pure. And I mean, Austen's not going that far, but she is, I mean, I think there's generally this sense that you know, nature rather than the city is kind of the place of virtue. So that's why you have that whole city versus country sort of divide in the novels of the 18th century. And then, you know, I mean, she'll play with that, but that's kind of the basic thing. But so I think here, when she's describing the landscape, I mean, look at just the way in which we don't get real sense of, you know, very particular things. They're qualities that get almost at moral aspects of Darcy. So this is the third paragraph of chapter 1. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence where the wood ceased and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building standing well on rising ground and backed by a ridge of high woody hills. And in front, a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. But the language there, large, handsome, you know, the sense of a building that is set in a landscape commanding attention. All those things are kind of important and get at that sense of how we look at Darcy. So it becomes really an icon in a way of Darcy, I guess.
But it's not but it's not invoking the sublime.
No.
It's a natural beauty, much more orderly and.
Yeah, no, she's not about terror here, you know, or any of that awe-inspiring thing. She's not pushing that far into the kind of romantic aesthetic, I guess. Yeah, I think that's right. Alec?
Well, I have a whole different question, which will lead completely away. And so you might want to defer it or something. Oh, and I love what you all have said. It's just great. I think when I am reading Jane Austen, as little as I have of the language, it seemed, by today's standards, it seems unnecessarily convoluted, way too much use of grammar, convoluted syntax. And I think of that as, we talk about the city versus the country, or nature versus art, as very cityfied language. It may be a class thing too. Only middle and upper class people could even figure out how to talk that way, I would think. I wonder if you all, I've missed one or two of the parts of the sessions, if anybody has said anything about that. It was so off-putting to me at first, but now I'm in the van of it, and I wonder if it fits in with what you all are saying, Austen's view not only of nature, but also of human character and so forth, and maybe even the character of the society, which she is to some degree critiquing, I think. That's my question.
Okay. I'm going to let Cheryl answer that.
Or respond to it, not necessarily answer, but I think that she is absolutely critiquing her society. And since I don't know all the like technical analysis words, like Marcia Huff just put the word metonym, I think, in the chat. So here's what I call it. I call it Austen's finger pointing moments, like the opening sentence of the novel. Why it's a finger point. Why is society the way that it is? Why can't I marry for love? Or why can't my dad's house pass to me and my sisters? And so regarding the convoluted language, kind of, I listened to this really great video on the way to work yesterday that finally made the free indirect discourse click, because it said it within, it explained the context of how Austen's novel fit with the novels that came before, where they were more epistolary, or I'll put the video in the chat. And then, so back to the return to so much nature, what going back to nature allows the characters to do is to interact with each other outside of those societal confines, with the conduct literature and who can be introduced when. They're able to just be people interacting with each other, talking about fishing. And then you see the contrast of that when Darcy and Bingley start visiting the Gardners, and we get Miss Bingley back in the situation, and she's hateful and you know, doing what she does best.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out where to go from here. I mean, that indoor-outdoor thing is so interesting. Lori Kaplan wrote an essay on, I think, I can't remember which one. One of the versions, the movie adaptations of Pride and Prejudice. I think it was her anyway. And one of the points she was making is how much, you know, the difference between indoor scenes and outdoor scenes in the novel. And so what Cheryl just said, I think really picks that up, especially this outdoor scene at Pemberley. They've got all this kind of social information from the indoors, right? I mean, they've learned about Darcy's father and his attachment to Wickham, and and the kind of family group that Wickham seemed to be a part of with those miniatures hanging, and that Darcy hasn't taken Wickham's miniature out of that room. They learn a lot from Mrs. Reynolds, just in terms of how Darcy is perceived in the community and in the household, and on the estate. She sees his taste, you know, in contrast to Lady Catherine's. And then, yeah, you're right. They walk outside and they meet him. And then he gets a chance to talk to the Gardners in this sort of semi-social setting. Before then, they're going to move back indoors. It's really fascinating. Joellen?
I had a couple of thoughts about Alex's use of the term convoluted language. And one is that, as with our readings, I think the last time we talked, we have moved away a lot from dramatic scenes, lots of funny dialogue and that kind of thing, so that we're into a different kind of Austen writing. But we've gone interior, as you were just stating. But also in terms of that particular chapter or paragraph that you just read, you were talking about the diction, the words chosen, as being almost as elegant as the house that's being described. And we can kind of compare that to the superlatives of Mrs. Jennings inside. But, you know, she talks about her master as being never this, always that, the best. And that's kind of at one end of taste also. Mrs. Gardner says she could hardly keep from laughing sometimes. But so we're to a kind of measured language here to some extent in this descriptions of landscaping that's also, I think, characterizing Elizabeth and where she's going now.
Yeah, and that's a point that Cheryl made that I think is a good one to pick up, that a lot of this language is that interior language that's not the snappy dialogue that we're used to in other parts of the novel. But also I think, just to say something more to Alex's point, I mean, Austen is really a child of 18th century prose. Virginia Woolf says something about how she takes the sentence that she's inherited and shakes it up and turns it into something new and living. And I mean, I think so. I don't quite see her, Alec, as convoluted as you do. But I mean, certainly she's inherited a structure that she uses and plays with, I think. Beverly?
I think of this chapter at the beginning as sort of for the reader, because up until this point, we have only hearsay really about Darcy, and he has not come off looking, like a good guy. I mean, we see him and his rudeness to Elizabeth at the dance, when he is indiscreet in talking about she's not handsome enough, or other men don't consider her handsome, so he won't either. And then we have the negative impression that we have about him from Wickham, that so we've got all of that, and then we walk into this scene and we see Darcy reflected in this practically perfect home that is tasteful, it's beautiful, it has artwork, he has maintained the natural setting in addition to having this gorgeous home. So it's sort of like our introduction to the real Darcy, I think. That's sort of how I felt when I read that. I mean, there's nothing out of place. His servants love him. He's loved in the community. And so we're getting much more of the real Darcy, I think, here, as we've kind of shifted gears from hearsay to reality.
Yeah, or if not reality, because who knows? I mean, Mrs. Reynolds is really enthusiastic, right? And the gardeners are kind of laughing at that. Elizabeth is less laughing at it, but she's trying to fit it into the other things she knows about him. I think one of the little jokes in this chapter is Reynolds, the name. I mean, Reynolds is the major portrait painter of the period. And here we have a portrait, but we also have Mrs. Reynolds painting a portrait for us and for Elizabeth as she's leading us through the house. So I think that's kind of neat. And we have if you think about the structure of this chapter, we have, introduction to the landscape, introduction to the house, right? We explore all that. And then we get to the portrait of Darcy. And then we get to the man. So we get lots of even physical ways of looking at him as we're hearing other things about how people, how he behaves, how people judge him. Marcia, you're muted, I think.
I'm trying to use my iPad and it doesn't go very well. So when you get to the portrait, the most telling part is that she sees the smile on his face that Elizabeth had often seen when he looked at her. And it's, of course, that's another time when we get finally the hints that we have had about Darcy falling in love with her, leading to his proposal, and now to her recognition that, well, he was always smiling at me. I mean, she was so prejudiced against him that she refused to even acknowledge the look on his face when he looked at her. And now, again, this is very much a moment. The whole scene is a time of discovery and what's the word? Epiphany.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, her epiphany of the real Darcy. That's all.
Yeah, and I do love that portrait scene. This is on page 240 in my edition. Elizabeth walked on in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture in earnest contemplation and returned to it again before they quitted the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken in his father's lifetime. But I mean, I also think it's interesting that, you know, she stands with its eyes fixed on her so that they can kind of commune here. Marcia, were you going to say something more?
No, that's all.
Okay. Your hand is still up. That's why.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
not very good at all of this.
Don't feel like the lone stranger.
Yeah. Cheryl.
I love being a 40-year-old woman with an 18-year-old son. I love how these moments of this budding love, all of those feelings, like it takes me back to those initial emotions that we had when we first fell in love. And from the video from the last meeting, I know that the group was talking about Elizabeth's reaction to being that first criticism from Darcy, not handsome enough to tempt me, and maybe in a defensive way, her mocking of that. So I think that after that insult, her guard was always up, her heckles were raised, and so that's how she missed that's how she missed his attraction. But also because this is a very structured, formulaic society, it made perfect sense to her that a man of 10,000 pounds a year would not be interested in her because of her family. So I don't think it was like just plain ignorance. It was also, there's so much logical structure to how these people think.
Yeah, I mean, and I was looking again today at the Wickham scene, where he tells the story, you know, of Darcy. And I mean, what struck me as I was reading that again is that she hears a story about these two guys who grow up in the same general family. You know, one is favored, the other is jealous. I mean, it's a story she recognizes, and she already has this disposition to dislike Darcy. So of course she's going to go with Wickham, besides the fact that he's really handsome and flattering. You know, so I mean, there are lots of ways I think that Austen is showing us that you know, the traps that are there when we try to understand people and when we judge them too quickly, especially if we're proud of our ability to judge people. Yeah, Joellen?
I was just thinking about, my brain just went off in a different direction, but about what Marcia was saying about epiphany. And we've talked a lot about chapter 1 and visions and appearances, likenesses, and she sees that smile. She's taking in a lot of information. And it seems to me in chapter 2 or 44 that she's processing it. And there, in fact, the huge epiphany is toward the end of chapter 2, where she is reevaluating what she thinks about Darcy intellectually, much the way she read his letter. And she ends up saying that above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill, which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. And she's really eloquently talking about that, gets back to this, such a change in a man of so much pride, excited not only astonishment, but gratitude. For to love, ardent love, it must be attributed. And as such, its impression on her was of a sort to be encouraged. And she's trying to decide by the end of this chapter, she realizes that she has some power over him. And the phrase is her trying to decide whether to employ this power, perhaps to move him back to another proposal.
Yeah.
And I love
Can
this
I
chapter.
interrupt you right
Yes,
here?
yeah.
Because this is a perfect sentence for Alec. You know, it's very complex. Such a change in a man of so much pride excited not only astonishment, but gratitude. For to love, ardent love, it must be attributed. I mean, she's qualifying here, right? And as such, its impression on her was of a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. I mean, she can't just say, wow, here. She's really kind of working through, what is it she wants? How do I deal with this? What do I think of it? It's not unpleasing, but I don't quite know what I feel. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him. She felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power, which her fancy told her she still possessed, of bringing on the renewal of his addresses. She can't say to herself, I think he loves me and I want him to ask me to marry him right now, and I will say yes. I mean, this goes back to what Cheryl was saying before, this is complicated feeling. And she's using the language that Alec was talking about and the grammar to keep herself safe, I think. Okay, Joellen, go back.
Quickly. I love this chapter too. She has noted in the first chapter that Darcy is working very hard to please her, to get to know the Gardners. That is furthered in the scene at the hotel in chapter 2 here. And in fact, that could be seen as, in the old romantic sense, a mark of love, but she sees that in herself also. And remember, we hear here about something new, Elizabeth being embarrassed to meet Georgiana, all this stuff. She's worried about pleasing people, even though she knows they're predisposed in her favor, but she sees that they're both courting favors of the people they're connected to. And so she's noting these things, finding evidence in herself as well as in Darcy.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because so much of it keeps looking back to earlier in the novel.
Yes.
A sense of embarrassment, or the smile that Marcia was talking about. The introduction, I was just kind of knocked over by this when Darcy says, will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to you? We know, because we watched Elizabeth's response to Mr. Collins saying that he was going to go and introduce himself to Darcy, that the superior is the person who will allow the introduction. So here is Darcy treating Elizabeth as the superior being to his sister, which completely knocks over the way he proposed to her the first time. Okay, Monica.
I really appreciate Joellen moving us onto this, and how, since she pointed it out, I see how interesting Elizabeth is in this chapter too, when she just in that first paragraph, she's quite amazed at her own discomposure and the perturbation of her feelings. And she's trying to figure herself out. And then on the next page on 250, Elizabeth on her side had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own and to make herself agreeable to all. And in the latter object, where she feared most to fail, she was most sure of success for those to whom she endeavored to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favor. So I love seeing this interiority and how much work she's doing. I mean, maybe that's part of the modern appeal of this, is we see somebody actually in the project of, self actualization, or actually trying to figure herself out, which I think is so modern of her.
Yeah, and it's so difficult, I mean, because there are all these, and just to go back to the previous chapter for a minute, she's really has a hard time talking to Darcy because all these subjects are embargoed. She can't say, "Oh, I love your place," because that's going to look like that's what she's interested in, and she can't talk about her family, and she, I mean, all these things are off, and so she's really struggling here, and I mean there and here to to kind of figure out what's going on and what she should do in there. Harriet.
This passage on gratitude actually raised my eyebrows because I was thinking along the lines of a kind of female virtue book description of female love being gratitude for being loved, and that makes me. And I was also thinking, John Browning has in the chat mentioned the ways in which this book is modern, and I'm thinking about Elizabeth as a modern heroine, but I'm also thinking about it, and he's also talking about transitional. And maybe John will come on and talk about his ideas about that. But I'm wondering about Austen's presentation of her heroines repeatedly as women who are attracted to us for their modernness. I was thinking too about self-sufficiency and nature, and anticipating Emerson and Elizabeth's walks in the natural world. But there is something about the flaws in Austen's heroines, that they are we love the fact that we're watching their growth, we're watching their education, but they are also presented as flawed young women. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Oh, I mean, I think that's what makes the novels comic, for one thing, because I mean, we do see their errors throughout and the ways in which they have to change. So, I mean, these become novels of education.
Yeah.
What I also think is interesting, it's not just about the women's education, it's also about the men's.
Right.
And if there's ever somebody who needed some education, it was Darcy. I mean, we've talked a lot here about how, she has not seen him and she's not understood him. And this is an opportunity for her to get a truer sense of his character. But I mean, we've heard him and seen him behave, and we know that he hasn't, always behaved well. And in fact, we're reminded of that at the end of the third chapter in this, when Miss Bingley says, "Oh, I remember, what you said when somebody told you that Elizabeth Bennet was accounted a beauty, and you said of her a beauty, I'd as soon as call her mother a wit." Well, we haven't heard that before. And if we had, that would have been another bad strike against Darcy. And he redeems himself here. But I mean, we see in this chapter, and we're reminded in this chapter of the ways in which he has not behaved well before. And he's working on this change too.
So I'm thinking now about the pattern of the romance novel and the idea of a woman who educates a man, and causes changes in him through her. While he's a rake, or he's in need of an education, Austen gets there early.
Yeah, she's not probably gonna educate many rakes. You know, and that's something I think she gets from Richardson and from others who say, don't even think of that. You know, it's not going to go well. And he gives us Clarissa or something like that and Lovelace as a model.
So we've got Wickham, who's
yeah,
yeah.
And now we know where that's going too by the end of this. Yeah, Cheryl.
So you mentioned the need for males to be educated, and I actually wanted to comment on, I wanted to say something for the fellas, and for us to remember that they had expectations set on their shoulders as well. So Colin seeking a bride among his cousins was commendable, actually. And Bingley, when he came to Netherfield, the text says that he had 5 sisters. And so I assume Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley were the 2 oldest, since they were the only ones that
well, that was the community who said he was coming down with 5 women. So we don't actually know that he has 5 sisters. I don't think he probably does, or we'd hear more about him. But anyway,
Darcy's parents are deceased, and he is independently wealthy, so he's able to make these decisions, or the decision to pursue Elizabeth Bennet. And that Monica mentioned the modern process of self-reflection, and I just wanted to highlight that because that's correct. And I think Jane Austen went through that, because after she expected to be engaged to Tom Lefroy, and because he had 10 or 11 other siblings and she didn't have any money, the family didn't approve. And so how much must that have disappointed her for her to take this subject up in this book?
Yeah, I want to move back to what you were saying about the men for a minute, because I think that is so true and so interesting. And in this section, we keep being reminded of Darcy's family responsibility. You know, Darcy is now 28, and we keep the miniatures were painted about 8 years ago when his father was alive, and Georgiana was 8, I think, at the time. And then the portrait was also painted when his father was alive. So we have all these images of him as a son. And we also know that Darcy inherited the estate when his father died 5 years ago. He was 23. At that point, Darcy, with Colonel Fitzwilliam, is responsible for bringing up his 11-year-old sister. And I mean, I think that's something that we don't think about enough. What, you know, that's going to shape really his sense of who he is. He is now the brother in the role as a parent at the age of 23, for somebody who's getting into these very difficult teenage years, and the years where she's also going to have to figure out, you know, what kind of a woman she is, who to marry. I mean, and he's in charge of that now. So, and we saw him writing letters to her. We heard him talking about education and female accomplishments. Now we come to Pemberley, and we see the way he's fitted up a new little sitting room for her. And then we see him introducing her to Elizabeth and trying to get them to, you know, be acquainted.
I forgot it was Monday. How are you?
So we've got this kind of sense of Darcy as this responsible party here, and we know about the Wickham situation. So all those things are kind of giving a sense of the difficulties, I think, is where I'm going with this, of his life and of his situation. And I think I just kind of went off into the blue yonder there, but what Cheryl was saying, I think really hit something.
Well, Susan, we're at 1 o'clock up against our time. I did want to read in the chat, John Browning was having trouble, but if you just be sure to check the chat. He said he found elements of romance, detective, epistolary, if I said that correctly, picaresque, Bildungsroman, anti-Bildungsroman. I'm probably butchering this, and novel of manners and country house novel, and all in this one reading. So I thought that's really interesting.
That's really interesting. I think.
Next week, Susan, I don't know if you have anything else to add. Next week, October 31, we'll discuss volume 3, chapters 5 through 10, and that might also be 47 through 52, depending on how your book is organized. Any closing thoughts?
Just that we're heading back home to Longbourn, and what is going to happen is my question with Lydia and with all of them. So
I hope that next time we do get to discuss that long conversation that Elizabeth and Darcy have about the letters from Jane, what she's learned in the letters from Jane.
Okay, yes, I will write that down. So
Is that next time?
Yes.
Okay.
Because a conversation.
It's our last meeting, isn't it?
No,
two
we have
more.
2 more.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 2 more.
I just thought it was the most open conversation they've had. All their other conversations have been so inhibited. So
yeah, I think that's a great place to start next time. So we'll kind of deal with the whole Lydia situation and start with Darcy and Elizabeth's discussion. How's that?
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.
See you next week.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.